Many people know that the Soviet Lada was the result of close cooperation between the Italian and Soviet sides. What is far less known is that under the original agreement, two Fiat models were meant to become Soviet, not just one. One standard car and one positioned as a more upmarket version. This is where the first major divergence appeared. Italian and Soviet engineers had very different ideas of what a luxury car was supposed to be. As a result, the Lada 2103 turned out not quite the way it could have been. Although in this case, not quite does not necessarily mean worse. But let's take this step by step. The cooperation between Fiat and the USSR was far from spontaneous. It began in the mid-1960s, when the top party leadership of the USSR decided to launch its own People's Car project. Not a Soviet-developed design, but a licensed one. The choice in favor of a foreign partner, rather than an in-house development, was driven by purely practical considerations. From the very beginning, the project was conceived with export markets in mind. Car exports provided a stable inflow of hard currency into the economy, and the most reliable way to succeed abroad was to offer a vehicle already familiar to Western buyers, even if it was produced under a domestic brand. Fiat was not the obvious frontrunner at first. Renault, Ford, Citroën, and Fiat itself were all considered as potential partners. In comparative testing across a number of parameters, Renault 16 often came out ahead. It featured front-wheel drive and a hatchback body, technical solutions that were far from self-evident at the time, and whose advantages were not yet universally accepted. Nevertheless, many Soviet specialists initially leaned toward the Renault option. However, a clear signal came from above. It was worth taking a closer look at the Italian partners. Their car was considered solid enough, and Italy itself was viewed as a country moving in the right direction. More importantly, unlike the other candidates, Fiat was willing not only to sell a license, but also to share technology. As a result, Fiat was chosen as the partner. In today's terms, the overall value of the agreement is estimated at around $2 billion. It covered a broad range of commitments: the construction, equipment, and launch of an automobile plant designed to produce up to 700,000 cars per year, the training of Soviet engineers, technologists, and workers, both at Fiat factories in Italy and directly in the USSR, technical support during the production launch, and assistance in resolving issues with the first production batches, and of course, licenses for two vehicles. The first of these was Fiat 124, the European Car of the Year for 1967. To adapt the Italian car to Soviet operating conditions, Italian and Soviet engineers had to introduce more than 800 changes to the original design. The second license model was intended to be more expensive and prestigious than the Fiat 124. The Italians already had a suitable candidate, the Fiat 125, which they saw as the basis for a higher status Soviet version. However, due to fundamental design differences between the 124 and the 125 in suspension, layout, and overall engineering logic, the Soviet side considered this option impractical. It would have meant mastering two technically different cars instead of a single unified family, whereas the plant's strategy from the outset was to maximize commonality, limiting differences to trim and exterior details. Rejecting the Fiat 125 narrowed the choice down to a single base model, the 124. At first glance, the solution seemed obvious. At the same time, Fiat was developing the Fiat 124 Special, an improved version of the base car. But the Fiat 124 Special did not fit either. While it retained the body and layout of the standard 124, it featured a different overhead cam engine, more complex fuel and electrical systems, and altered transmission characteristics. In essence, it was a transitional variant that, in key components, was already moving closer to the more complex Fiat 125. The Soviet side followed a different logic. First, master the basic model, and only then develop a more prestigious luxury version on its foundation. After that, the two sides focused on developing a better-equipped version based on the Fiat 124, while preserving maximum unification. Work on the future luxury Lada was carried out with joint engineering involvement from Fiat specialists and Soviet engineers. The car's design was developed by the Fiat Styling Center, and the appearance of the Lada 2103 closely echoed the previously mentioned Fiat 124 Special. At the same time, chrome was used generously on the Soviet version. Upper and lower moldings, the grille, and even chrome trim on the wheel arches were all part of the design. The abundance of chrome had a simple purpose. The Lada 2103 was meant to signal the owner's high social status at a glance, and to emphasize that this car was almost 1.5 times more expensive than the basic Lada 2101. However, the use of so many horizontal moldings on adjacent but separate body panels raised concerns among Soviet production engineers. The key question was whether all the lines would align properly on production cars. Even minor deviations in the placement of mounting holes in the fenders and doors could result in visible misalignment that would be difficult to correct. Fiat specialists assured the factory that their manufacturing standards would allow the molding lines to remain perfectly aligned, even if the holes were formed during stamping rather than drilled during final assembly. In the end, the Italians were proven right. The Lada 2103 debuted in 1972, with series production starting the same year. And if even the basic Lada 2101 was often the ultimate dream for an average Soviet citizen, the more luxurious 2103 made an even stronger impression. For both Soviet and Eastern European motorists, its interior looked genuinely upscale. A plush carpet, 5 separate round gauges, including a tachometer and an oil pressure gauge, and even an analog clock mounted at the top of the center dashboard. Even the exposed metal in the upper part of the doors was covered with trim pieces, something the simpler Lada 2101 did not have. It was clear that the Lada 2103 was better than the base model in almost every respect, roughly in proportion to how much more expensive it was. Naturally, a car with a more refined exterior and interior could not rely on the modest 1.2-liter engine of the base version. Engine displacement was increased to 1,451 cubic centimeters by extending the piston stroke to 80 millimeters while keeping the bore unchanged. The power increase was noticeable, from 62 to 75 horsepower. This allowed the car, now weighing about 1,030 kilograms, to deliver respectable performance. Acceleration to 100 kilometers per hour took around 19 seconds, while top speed reached 150 kilometers per hour, an impressive figure by Soviet standards. The braking system largely followed the base model, with disc brakes at the front and drum brakes at the rear, but the Lada 2103 was equipped with a vacuum brake booster. Sound insulation was also significantly improved compared to the Lada 2101. Overall, by Soviet standards, this was an exceptionally luxurious car, comparable only to official government Volgas and affordable only to very wealthy citizens. Exports to Western Europe began in 1973 under the name Lada 1500. In Europe, the car was positioned as a solid, simple, and reliable family vehicle, with no claims of luxury. At the same time, the Lada 1500 was noticeably more expensive than the Lada 1200, and competed directly with cars such as the Opel Kadett B, Renault 12, and Ford Escort Mark I. This is where the problem emerged. In this competitive segment, Lada lacked its main advantage, price. Low cost had always been the brand's strongest asset in foreign markets. Buyers were willing to overlook rougher build quality and an aging design, but only as long as the car was clearly cheaper than its competitors. The Lada 1500 never became an export hit. It certainly found its buyers, but the real sales driver in Europe remained the Lada 1200, whose price was often roughly a quarter lower than that of comparable rivals. As a result, somewhat unexpectedly, the main market for the luxury Lada turned out to be the domestic Soviet and Eastern European markets. Despite being significantly more expensive than any other Soviet car except the Volga, the Lada 2103 remained a highly desirable purchase, with demand consistently exceeding supply. This may sound conditional in the context of the Soviet system and its waiting lists, but even by those standards, the Lada 2103 held a special status. By refocusing the model on the internal market, the factory filled a small but important niche. In a society built on formal equality, leading engineers, artists, and prominent athletes still needed a more prestigious car than what was available to the general public. And it was precisely for this audience that the Lada 2103 was intended. However, the Lada 2103 did not remain at the top for long. In 1976, just 4 years after production began, a new model appeared, the Lada 2106, which became the peak of Lada's evolution at that time. If the Lada 2103 was positioned as a luxury version of the basic Lada 2101, the 6 was intended to be an even more comfortable and dynamic evolution of the same concept. At the same time, designers still had no free hand when it came to body redesign. As with the 2103, only limited changes to the front and rear were permitted. The new car was meant to shed the distinct 60s look. Chrome was rapidly going out of fashion, while plastic was becoming the new modern standard. At the same time, engineers faced a conflicting task. The more luxurious model had to be cheaper to produce than its predecessor, which meant abandoning complex and costly manufacturing solutions. There was also another challenge. The Italian-based design had to be improved without ruining it in the process. The new model received a revised engine with increased cylinder bore, bringing displacement to 1.6 liters and output to 80 horsepower. The transmission was also reworked, making the car better suited for higher cruising speeds. Naturally, the price went up as well. The 6 became not only the most prestigious, but also the most expensive Lada in the lineup. Even the four-wheel drive Lada Niva was cheaper. On foreign markets, unlike the 2103, the new model proved successful and found its niche. The Lada 1600 offered a simple and effective formula: a large body, a 1.6-liter engine, low price, and straightforward engineering. And it worked. The Lada 1600 even made it across the ocean and was sold in Canada, although Europe remained its primary export market. For nearly 10 years, the two models were produced side by side, and only in 1985 was the Lada 2103 finally taken out of production. Throughout that entire period, its exterior design remained virtually unchanged. On the one hand, there was little urgent need to update it. The Italian-designed body had aged remarkably well. On the other, there was a group of buyers who deliberately preferred chrome, even as it began to look outdated by the 1980s. For them, the chrome-heavy Lada 2103 remained more appealing than the increasingly plastic-heavy Lada 2106. The Lada 2106, meanwhile, stayed in production for an unreasonably long time, all the way until 2006. Over that span, it went from being the top model in the lineup and a true object of desire to an outright anachronism. At a certain point, the same car came to be perceived in completely different ways by different groups of buyers. Younger motorists tended to see it as an outdated and simplified design that had lost its former status. Older drivers, by contrast, continued to view it as the Lada, once the most expensive, dynamic, and well-finished car ever produced by the Togliatti automobile plant. By that time, however, little of that former prestige remained. As for Fiat, the company ultimately did find a home for its 125 model. The production license went to Poland, where the car was built as the Polish Fiat 125P. It was not the original Italian Fiat 125, but a simplified version, with the same body yet using older and simpler mechanical components. At the same time, this exterior design was likely close to what Italian engineers originally envisioned for a more upscale version of the Lada. That leaves an open question. Which approach worked better in the end, the original concept or the version that was ultimately produced in the Soviet Union? If you notice that this video did not cover the Porsche-backed modernization project of the Lada 2103, that was intentional. I discussed that topic in detail in a separate video dedicated to the history of the Lada Samara. There is also a dedicated playlist on the channel focused on the history of Lada as a whole, from the Fiat agreement to both successful and less successful models, including the Polish Fiat 125P. This brings the story of the 4 headlight Ladas to an end. Thank you for watching. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. I try to respond to most of them. See you in future videos.